Tom Rivera had been looking forward to this Saturday morning for weeks. The weather was perfect, with a light breeze rippling across the surface of his private lake. He'd owned this 50-acre ranch for 12 years now, and the lake was his pride and joy. He'd spent thousands of dollars stocking it with bass and trout, creating the perfect fishing spot right in his backyard. At 6 in the morning, Tom grabbed his favorite fishing rod and a thermos of coffee. The sun was just starting to peek over the hills, casting a golden glow across the water. This was his sanctuary, his place to think and relax away from the stress of running his small construction business. He'd built a simple wooden dock that stretched about 20 feet into the lake. Nothing fancy, just sturdy enough to hold him and his gear. Tom settled into his folding chair, baited his hook with a fresh worm, and cast his line into the calm water. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the dock and the occasional bird call from the trees surrounding the lake. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Tom caught 2 nice-sized bass and was working on his second cup of coffee when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The distant wail of sirens was getting closer, much closer. At first, he figured someone was having a medical emergency at one of the houses down the road. The Sunset Ridge neighborhood had expanded over the years, with fancy houses built right up to his property line. But the sirens weren't passing by. They were coming straight toward his ranch. Tom stood up, shading his eyes against the morning sun. 3 police cars were racing down his long gravel driveway, dust clouds billowing behind them. His heart started pounding. Had something happened to his wife? Was there some kind of emergency he didn't know about? The police cars came to a screeching halt about 50 yards from the lake. 6 officers jumped out, and Tom's confusion turned to shock when he realized they were all looking directly at him. Their hands were resting on their weapons, and they were approaching him like he was some kind of dangerous criminal. "Sir, step away from the water and put your hands where we can see them," shouted the lead officer, a tall man with graying hair. Tom's fishing rod nearly slipped from his hands. "What's going on, officer?" "I live here. This is my property. Just step away from the water, sir. We need to talk to you about some complaints we've received." Tom's mind was racing. Complaints? About what? He set down his fishing rod and walked slowly toward the officers, his hands raised slightly. The whole situation felt like a bad dream. "I'm Tom Rivera. I own this ranch. What complaints are you talking about?" Before the officer could answer, 2 more cars pulled up. One was a white sedan with HOA security printed on the side. The other was a silver SUV. Out of the SUV stepped a woman Tom recognized immediately, Patricia Henley, the president of the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. She was a thin woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Patricia said, marching toward them with a folder clutched in her hands. "This man has been illegally fishing in our community water resource for months now. We've asked him repeatedly to stop, but he keeps coming back." Tom's jaw dropped. "Our community water resource? Lady, this is my lake. I've owned this property since 2011. I have the deed right here in my truck." "Sir, we're going to need you to calm down," said the lead officer. "Mrs. Henley here called us because residents have reported unauthorized fishing activity. She says this lake falls under HOA jurisdiction." "That's absolutely ridiculous," Tom said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "I bought this land 12 years ago. I dug this lake myself. I stocked it with my own money. How can it possibly be under HOA jurisdiction?" Patricia opened her folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "As you can see, officer, this entire area was rezoned last year as part of our community water management plan. Any fishing activities require proper permits and HOA approval." Tom felt like he was living in some kind of alternate reality. "This is insane. You can't just decide my private property belongs to your HOA. I pay property taxes on this land. I have a deed that clearly shows the boundaries. Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back," the lead officer said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're arresting me for fishing on my own property. We're detaining you while we sort this out. Mrs. Henley has documentation that suggests there's a dispute over the ownership of this water source." The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Tom's wrists. He couldn't believe this was happening. 12 years he'd lived here peacefully. 12 years he'd been fishing in his own lake without a single problem. Now he was being treated like a criminal because some HOA president decided she wanted control over his property. "My phone is in my truck," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can show you the deed, the property survey, everything. This is all just a huge misunderstanding." Patricia shook her head. "I'm afraid the documentation is quite clear. This water source has been designated as a community resource. Mr. Rivera here has been trespassing." More cars were arriving now. Tom could see some of his neighbors gathering at the property line, pointing and taking pictures with their phones. The humiliation was overwhelming. Here he was, handcuffed in his own backyard, being treated like some kind of criminal in front of people he'd lived next to for over a decade. One of the younger officers jogged over to Tom's truck and came back with his phone. "Sir, if you can tell me your passcode, I can show the officers your documentation." Tom gave him the code, grateful that at least someone was willing to listen to reason. The officer scrolled through his phone until he found the photos Tom had taken of his deed and property survey. "Hey, Sergeant," the young officer called out. "You need to see this. This guy's got documentation showing he owns this entire area, including the lake." The sergeant walked over and examined the phone screen. Tom watched his expression change as he looked at the property boundaries clearly marked on the survey. "Mrs. Henley," the sergeant said slowly, "this documentation appears to show that Mr. Rivera does indeed own this property, including the lake." Patricia's confident smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Those documents could be forged. I have official HOA records that supersede any previous claims. The county has already approved our water management jurisdiction." "That's not how property ownership works," Tom said, his frustration boiling over. "You can't just decide you want my lake and make up some fake jurisdiction. This is America, not some banana republic." The sergeant looked uncomfortable. He clearly realized they'd made a mistake. But Patricia was standing there with her folder full of official-looking papers, insisting she had the legal authority. "Look," the sergeant said finally, "we're going to need to sort this out at the station. Mr. Rivera, we're going to release you, but you need to stay away from this lake until we can verify the ownership situation." "Stay away from my own lake?" Tom couldn't hide the disbelief in his voice. "Sergeant, with all due respect, I was drinking my morning coffee and fishing for base. I wasn't disturbing anyone. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was enjoying my own property that I pay taxes on. I understand your frustration, sir, but until we can verify the legal status of this property, we need everyone to stay clear of any potential dispute areas." They uncuffed Tom, but the damage was done. Word was already spreading through the neighborhood. People were posting videos on social media. Tom Rivera, the quiet rancher who minded his own business, was being painted as some kind of trespasser and troublemaker. As the police cars pulled away, Patricia approached Tom with that cold smile of hers. "Mr. Rivera, I hope you understand that we're just trying to protect our community resources. I'm sure we can work something out." Tom looked at her for a long moment. Something in her tone told him this was far from over. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous than a simple property dispute. "Mrs. Henley," he said quietly, "I think you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Tom spent the rest of that Saturday in a daze. After 12 years of peaceful morning fishing sessions, he couldn't wrap his head around what had just happened. His wife Linda was furious when he told her about the police cars and the handcuffs. She'd been married to Tom for 25 years and had never seen him so shaken up. "They can't just decide they own our lake," Linda said, pacing around their kitchen. "This is our home. We've put our life savings into this place." Tom nodded, but something was nagging at him. Patricia Henley had seemed too prepared, too confident. She'd had all those official-looking documents ready to go, almost like she'd been planning this confrontation for a while. "I'm going to do some digging," Tom told his wife. "Something doesn't feel right about this whole thing." Over the next few days, Tom started making phone calls. He called the county office to ask about any recent zoning changes. He called his insurance company to make sure his property coverage was still valid. He even called his old real estate agent to double-check his deed information. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The county clerk told him that the Sunset Ridge HOA had indeed filed paperwork, requesting jurisdiction over community water resources in the area. But the really shocking part was the date on the filing. They'd submitted this request 6 months ago, long before Saturday's fishing incident. "Sir," the clerk said over the phone, It looks like they've been working on this for quite some time. They've filed multiple requests and appeals. Someone over there really wants control of the water sources in your area." Tom felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't some spontaneous decision by Patricia Henley. This was a planned attack on his property rights. He decided to do more investigating. Tom drove over to the county planning office and requested copies of all the documents the HOA had filed. What he found there was even more disturbing. The HOA hadn't just been targeting his lake. They'd been systematically filing complaints and requests related to several properties in the area. There were noise complaints about Tom's occasional use of a small boat motor. There were environmental concerns about fishing activities. There were even complaints about the unsightly appearance of his dock. But the most shocking discovery was a set of architectural plans tucked into the back of the file. Detailed blueprints for a luxury community center, complete with exclusive fishing rights for HOA members. The plans showed Tom's lake as the centerpiece of this new development. At the bottom of the plans, Tom saw a name that made everything click into place. Henley Construction Company. Patricia's husband owned a construction business, and these plans had his company's logo all over them. Tom felt like he'd been punched in the gut. This wasn't about community water management or environmental protection. This was about money. Big money. Patricia and her husband were trying to steal his property so they could build their luxury development and cash in. He made copies of everything and drove straight home to show Linda. She was as shocked as he was. "They've been planning this for months," Linda said, studying the architectural plans. "Look at this. They want to build a clubhouse right where our house is. They want to turn our entire property into some kind of resort for rich people." Tom noticed something else in the documents that made him even angrier. The HOA had hired a new management company called Prestige Property Solutions just 8 months ago. According to their website, Prestige specialized in strategic property acquisition and maximizing community asset value. In plain English, they were professional property grabbers. Tom called Prestige Property Solutions and pretended to be interested in their services for another HOA. The sales pitch he got was eye-opening. "We help homeowner associations identify underutilized properties in their area and develop strategies to bring them under community control," the salesman explained. "It's perfectly legal when done through proper regulatory channels. We've helped dozens of communities expand their amenities and increase property values." "What if the current property owners don't want to sell?" Tom asked. "Well, that's where our expertise really shines. We know how to create the right kind of pressure to encourage cooperation. Zoning complaints, environmental concerns, safety violations. Most property owners find it easier to work with us than fight us." Tom hung up the phone, feeling sick. These people were professional bullies. They made a living stealing property from honest people who just wanted to be left alone. But the worst was yet to come. Later that week, Tom found a certified letter in his mailbox. It was from the HOA, informing him that his property was in violation of 17 different community standards. According to the letter, his dock was an unauthorized structure. His boat was creating noise, pollution. His fishing activities were causing environmental degradation. The letter demanded that Tom remove all his fishing equipment, tear down his dock, and cease all recreational activities on the lake within 30 days. If he failed to comply, the HOA would seek legal action and daily fines of $500. Tom read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. They weren't just trying to steal his lake. They were trying to make his life so miserable that he'd sell his entire property and move away. He called a lawyer that afternoon. Richard Walsh was a local attorney who specialized in property rights cases. Tom had never needed a lawyer before, but he was smart enough to know he was in over his head. "Mr. Rivera," Walsh said after reviewing the documents, "I've seen this kind of thing before. It's called property harassment, and it's becoming more common as HOAs get more aggressive. The good news is that your property rights are very clear. The bad news is that defending those rights is going to cost you time and money." "How much money?" Tom asked. "Could be anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000 depending on how far they want to push this. These management companies know that most people can't afford a long legal battle. They're counting on you giving up." Tom felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He was a small business owner, not a wealthy man. $100,000 in legal fees could bankrupt him. But then he thought about Saturday morning, handcuffed in his own backyard while his neighbors took pictures. He thought about Patricia Henley's cold smile and her husband's construction plans. He thought about some corporate bully trying to steal the property he'd worked his whole life to pay for. "Mr. Walsh," Tom said, "I want to fight this. I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes." "They picked the wrong guy to mess with," Walsh smiled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say, because I've been looking for a good case to go after these property grabbers. They've been getting away with this stuff for too long." Over the next few days, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Tom learned that Patricia Henley had been pushing the HOA board to hire Prestige Property Solutions specifically to go after his property. She'd convinced the other board members that bringing the lake under HOA control would increase everyone's property values. What the other board members didn't know was that Patricia and her husband had already signed a secret contract with a luxury resort developer. If they could get control of Tom's lake, they stood to make over $2 million from the development deal. Tom also discovered that Patricia had been spreading rumors about him in the neighborhood. She'd been telling people that his fishing activities were contaminating the water supply. She claimed his dock was creating safety hazards for children. She even suggested that he was running some kind of illegal business out of his property. None of it was true, but Patricia knew that if she repeated the lies often enough, some people would start to believe them. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Tom's neighbors, an elderly man named Bill Thompson, knocked on his door one evening with a manila envelope. "Tom," Bill said, "I've been watching what's been happening to you, and it isn't right. I recorded this conversation last week, and I think you need to hear it." Inside the envelope was a digital recorder. Bill had been working in his garden when Patricia Henley and two other HOA board members had a conversation right next to his fence. They thought no one could hear them, but Bill had been recording bird sounds for a nature project and accidentally captured their entire conversation. Tom listened to the recording with growing anger. Patricia was bragging about how easy it had been to get the police to arrest Tom. She talked about the next phase of their plan, which involved filing environmental complaints with the state to force Tom to drain his lake entirely. "Once we get rid of the water," Patricia's voice said on the recording, "he'll have nothing left worth fighting for. He'll sell cheap just to get out from under all the legal problems." The other board members sounded uncomfortable, but Patricia kept pushing. "Look, this is a 50-acre property with water frontage. Do you know what that's worth in today's market? We're talking about millions of dollars in increased community value. All we have to do is apply a little pressure in the right places." Tom turned off the recorder and sat in silence for a long moment. Now he understood exactly what he was up against. This wasn't just about his property. This was about greed, corruption, and abuse of power. Patricia Henley had made one critical mistake, though. She'd assumed Tom would be like all the other property owners who'd been bullied into giving up. She thought he'd roll over and play dead rather than fight back. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Richard Walsh didn't waste any time. The Monday after Tom brought him the recorded conversation, the lawyer filed an emergency injunction in county court to stop the HOA from interfering with Tom's property rights. But Walsh also did something that caught everyone off guard. He filed a countersuit against the HOA for harassment, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights. "Mr. Rivera," Walsh explained in his office, "we're not just going to play defense here. These people have been systematically attacking your property rights for months. It's time to make them pay for what they've done." The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Tom had never been in a courtroom before, and he was nervous as he sat at the plaintiff's table next to Walsh. Across the room, Patricia Henley sat with three expensive-looking lawyers from a big city firm. Judge Harrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been hearing property disputes for over 20 years. She listened patiently as Walsh presented Tom's case, showing the court the original deed, property surveys, and tax records that clearly established Tom's ownership of the lake. "Your Honor," Walsh said, "Mr. Rivera has owned this property for 12 years. He's paid taxes on it, maintained it, and improved it with his own money. The defendants have no legal claim whatsoever to this lake or any other part of his property. When it was the HOA's turn, their lead attorney tried to argue that the lake fell under community water resource regulations. But when Judge Harrison asked to see the specific law that gave HOAs authority over private lakes, the lawyer couldn't produce one. "Your Honor, The HOA lawyer stammered. We believe that recent environmental regulations give us oversight authority over water sources that could affect the broader community. Judge Harrison looked unimpressed. Counselor, believing something doesn't make it legally true. Do you have any statute or regulation that specifically grants your client authority over privately owned lakes? Well, no, Your Honor, but then I'm granting the injunction, Judge Harrison said firmly. The defendants are hereby ordered to cease all interference with Mr. Rivera's use and enjoyment of his property. Furthermore, I'm scheduling a full hearing on Mr. Rivera's countersuit for 60 days from today. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least he could go back to fishing in his own lake. But as they left the courtroom, Walsh warned him that this was just the beginning. They're going to fight this hard, Walsh said. They've got too much money at stake to give up easy. Get ready for things to get ugly. Walsh was right. The very next week, Tom found another certified letter in his mailbox. This time, the HOA was citing him for 17 different violations of community standards. His truck was parked inappropriately. His mailbox was the wrong color. His fence needed community approval. Even his dog was supposedly violating noise ordinances. Each violation carried a fine of $250 per day until corrected. The HOA was demanding over $4,000 in immediate fines, with more accumulating daily. Tom called Walsh immediately. Can they do this? I thought the judge told them to stop harassing me. They're trying to get around the injunction by claiming these are separate issues, Walsh explained. Don't worry. We'll file a motion for contempt of court. Judge Harrison isn't going to appreciate this kind of game playing. But the harassment didn't stop there. Tom started getting visits from county inspectors, claiming they'd received anonymous complaints about his property. A building inspector showed up to examine his dock. A health inspector wanted to test his well water. An environmental inspector demanded to examine his lake for potential contamination. Each inspection required Tom to take time off work. Each inspector seemed to find minor issues that required expensive corrections. Tom realized this was part of the strategy. They were trying to bury him in bureaucracy and fees until he couldn't afford to fight anymore. The worst part was what was happening in the neighborhood. Patricia Henley had been busy spreading her poison, and some of Tom's neighbors were starting to believe her lies. People who'd waved to him for years were now giving him cold stares. Someone put a flyer in everyone's mailbox claiming Tom's fishing activities were contaminating our children's water supply. Tom's wife, Linda, was getting the worst of it. Women who'd been friendly with her for years were now snubbing her at the grocery store. Someone even called her employer to complain that she was married to that man who's polluting our water. I can't take much more of this, Linda told Tom one evening. Maybe we should just sell and move somewhere else. Tom understood how she felt. The stress was getting to him too. He was losing sleep, losing weight, and losing money every day. He had to deal with inspectors and lawyers instead of running his business. But then something happened that changed everything. Tom was sitting on his dock early one morning, trying to enjoy a peaceful cup of coffee before the day's harassment began, when he noticed a car parked on the road just beyond his property line. Someone was taking pictures of his house and lake with a long telephoto lens. Tom walked over to investigate and found a man in an expensive suit setting up professional photography equipment. Excuse me, Tom said. Can I ask what you're doing? The man looked startled. Oh, I'm just taking some landscape photos for a real estate project. Real estate project? Whose project? The photographer looked uncomfortable. I'm not supposed to discuss the details. I was just hired to document the property. Tom felt his anger rising. Document my property? Who hired you? Before the photographer could answer, Tom's phone started ringing. It was Walsh. Tom, you need to get down to my office right away. The HOA just filed a major lawsuit against you. They're claiming your lake is an environmental hazard and demanding that you drain it completely. Tom felt like he'd been hit by a truck. They want me to drain my lake? It gets worse. They're also claiming that your property improvements were done without proper permits and demanding that you tear down your dock and remove all your fishing equipment. But I've had that dock for 8 years. No one ever said anything about permits. I know, this is pure harassment. But here's the really interesting part. They filed this lawsuit through a shell company called Sunset Development, LLC. I did some digging, and guess who owns Sunset Development? Tom's blood ran cold. Patricia Henley's husband. Bingo. They're not even trying to hide their real agenda anymore. They want your property, and they're willing to destroy your life to get it. Tom looked back at the photographer who was quickly packing up his equipment. Everything suddenly made sense. They were already planning what to do with his land once they forced him out. That afternoon, Tom met with Walsh to review the new lawsuit. The legal document was thick with technical language and environmental jargon, but the bottom line was simple. The HOA was claiming that Tom's lake posed an immediate danger to public health and safety and had to be eliminated. "This is insane," Tom said. "I've been swimming in that lake for 12 years. My dog drinks from it every day. How is it suddenly a public health hazard?" "It's not," Walsh replied. "But they've hired an environmental consulting firm to write a report claiming it is. The same consulting firm, by the way, that Prestige Property Solutions uses in all their property-grabbing cases." Walsh showed Tom the environmental report. It was full of scientific-sounding language about potential bacterial contamination and unregulated water chemistry. But when Tom read the actual test results, everything came back normal. "They're just making stuff up," Tom said. "Essentially, yes. But here's the problem. Fighting this kind of lawsuit requires expensive expert witnesses and environmental testing. We're talking about another $50,000 in legal fees minimum." Tom felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His savings account was already depleted from the legal bills he'd already paid. His business was suffering because he was spending so much time dealing with lawyers and inspectors instead of working. "Mr. Walsh," Tom said finally, "what happens if I can't afford to keep fighting?" Walsh looked at him seriously. "Then they win. They'll get a court order forcing you to drain your lake and tear down your dock. Once that happens, your property value will collapse and you'll probably have to sell for a fraction of what it's worth, which is exactly what they want." Tom sat in silence for a long moment. Everything he'd worked for his entire life was hanging in the balance. His home, his land, his peaceful retirement plans, all because some greedy HOA president and her husband wanted to make a few $1,000,000. But then Tom thought about something his father had told him years ago. "Son, there comes a time in every man's life when he has to decide what kind of person he really is. You can either stand up for what's right or you can let the bullies win." Tom looked up at Walsh. "I want to fight this. All the way. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. I'm not going to let these people steal my property." Walsh smiled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. Because I've been doing some investigating of my own. And I think these people have made some very serious mistakes. Mistakes that could end up costing them a lot more than they're trying to steal from you." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that could land them in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud. The kind that could result in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against them. The kind that could turn this whole thing around and make you the winner instead of the victim." Tom felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. "What do you need me to do?" "Just keep being yourself," Walsh said. "Keep fishing in your lake. Keep living your life and keep documenting every single thing they do to harass you. Because we're going to use all of it against them when we get our day in court." As Tom drove home that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. He felt like he was finally going to get justice. What he didn't know was that Patricia Henley and her conspirators were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. A mistake that would expose their entire criminal operation and cost them everything they'd worked to steal. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom's neighbor Bill Thompson, the same man who'd recorded Patricia Henley's incriminating conversation, called Tom with urgent news. "Tom, you need to get over here right now," Bill said. "I caught them red-handed." Tom rushed over to Bill's house and found his elderly neighbor standing in his backyard with a digital camera in his hands. Bill was practically shaking with excitement. "I couldn't sleep last night, so I was sitting by my window reading when I saw flashlights moving around your property," Bill explained. "At first I thought it might be burglars, but then I recognized one of the voices. It was Patricia Henley." Bill showed Tom the photos he'd taken through his telephoto lens. The images were grainy but clear enough to identify 3 people trespassing on Tom's property at 2 in the morning. Patricia Henley, her husband David, and a man Tom didn't recognize were walking around his lake with flashlights and what looked like surveying equipment. "They were out there for over an hour," Bill said, "taking measurements, collecting water samples, marking trees. They had no right to be on your land." Tom felt his anger rising. It was one thing to harass him through legal channels, but sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night was crossing a line. "Did you call the police?" Tom asked. "I thought about it, but then I remembered what happened last time the police got involved. I figured you'd want to handle this through your lawyer." Tom was grateful for Bill's wisdom. Walsh would know exactly what to do with this evidence, but Bill wasn't done. There's something else. I've been watching them for weeks now, and this isn't the first time they've been on your property without permission. I've got photos from 3 different nights. Walsh was thrilled when Tom brought him the evidence. This is perfect. Criminal trespassing, violation of the court injunction, and evidence of conspiracy. We can use this to destroy their credibility. But Walsh had even bigger news. His private investigator had been digging into Prestige Property Solutions and had uncovered something shocking. Tom, you're not the first victim of this scam, Walsh explained. My investigator found 7 other cases in 3 different counties where Prestige Property Solutions has done exactly the same thing. They target rural properties with water access, use HOA harassment to pressure the owners, then swoop in with development deals once the property values collapse. Walsh showed Tom newspaper articles about other property owners who'd been forced to sell after HOA harassment campaigns. In every case, the same pattern emerged. Sudden HOA complaints, environmental concerns, legal pressure, and eventual forced sales to development companies connected to HOA board members. The FBI is already investigating them for mail fraud and conspiracy, Walsh said. And now that we have evidence of them trespassing on your property while under a court injunction, we can add obstruction of justice to the list. Tom felt a surge of hope, but Walsh warned him that the fight was far from over. They're going to get desperate now, Walsh said. Desperate people do dangerous things. You need to be very careful. Walsh was right to be worried. The next week brought a new level of harassment that shocked even Tom. He woke up one morning to find that someone had dumped industrial garbage in his lake during the night. Old tires, construction debris, and even some kind of chemical waste were floating in the water. Tom called the environmental authorities immediately, but by the time they arrived, Patricia Henley was already there with a local news crew. This is exactly what we've been warning about, Patricia told the TV reporter. Mr. Rivera's unregulated fishing activities have turned this lake into an environmental disaster. Our children's safety is at risk. Tom watched in horror as the news report made it look like he was responsible for polluting his own lake. The reporter didn't mention that Tom had called to report the dumping himself. They didn't interview Tom or ask for his side of the story. They just filmed Patricia's accusations and the polluted water. This is character assassination, Tom told Walsh. They're destroying my reputation along with my property. But Walsh had a surprise for Tom. Actually, they just handed us the evidence we needed to prove criminal conspiracy. My investigator has been monitoring their communications, and we intercepted some very interesting phone calls. Walsh played a recording that made Tom's blood boil. It was Patricia Henley talking to someone about Phase 3 of the contamination strategy. The garbage dump worked perfectly, Patricia's voice said on the recording. The news coverage makes him look like an environmental criminal. Now we move to Phase 4. Anonymous complaints to the health department about contaminated well water. The voice on the other end was David Henley, Patricia's husband. What if someone gets sick from the chemicals we dumped? That's not our problem, Patricia replied coldly. We just need to create enough public pressure to force him out. Once we get the property, we can clean up the lake and blame all the contamination on his fishing activities. Tom felt sick listening to the recording. These people were willing to poison his property and risk public health just to steal his land. How did you get this recording? Tom asked. Let's just say that some very serious federal agents are taking a very serious interest in this case, Walsh replied. The FBI doesn't like it when people commit environmental crimes as part of conspiracy schemes. Things moved quickly after that. The FBI raided Prestige Property Solutions offices and seized their computers and files. They also executed search warrants on Patricia and David Henley's house and business. The local news, which had been so quick to paint Tom as an environmental criminal, suddenly had a very different story to tell. Headlines like FBI investigates HOA conspiracy and local couple charged with environmental crimes replaced the earlier stories about Tom's supposed pollution. Tom felt vindicated, but the best was yet to come. Walsh's investigator had been busy tracking down other victims of the Prestige Property Solutions scam. What they found was a pattern of criminal activity going back 5 years. Tom, we've identified 14 separate properties where they've pulled this same scam, Walsh explained. The total value of the property they've stolen or attempted to steal is over $30 million. This is organized crime, plain and simple. The FBI investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Prestige Property Solutions had been working with corrupt HOA boards across 3 states to identify valuable properties and force the owners to sell below market value. They'd used fake environmental reports, fraudulent legal documents, and even bribery to accomplish their goals. Patricia and David Henley were arrested on federal charges of conspiracy, mail fraud, environmental crimes, and racketeering. The owner of Prestige Property Solutions was charged with running a criminal enterprise. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators searched the Henleys' computers. They found detailed plans not just for Tom's property, but for a dozen other properties in the area. The Henleys and their co-conspirators had been planning to essentially take over the entire Sunset Ridge neighborhood through HOA harassment and fraudulent legal claims. They weren't just targeting you, Walsh told Tom. You were just the first step in a much bigger plan. They wanted to control hundreds of acres of prime real estate through fake HOA authority. The evidence was overwhelming. Email conversations between the conspirators discussed specific strategies for breaking property owners who wouldn't sell voluntarily. They had detailed psychological profiles of their targets and customized harassment campaigns for each victim. One email from Patricia Henley made Tom's stomach turn. The Rivera target is showing more resistance than expected. Recommend escalating to Phase 5 contamination protocol. Once his well water tests positive for toxins, he'll have no choice but to sell. They had been planning to poison his drinking water. The case attracted national attention when the story broke. Property rights advocates held rallies supporting Tom's fight against HOA overreach. Legal experts called it one of the most comprehensive property fraud schemes they'd ever seen. Tom found himself in the strange position of being a reluctant hero. Television crews camped out at his ranch, wanting to interview the man who'd exposed the conspiracy by refusing to give up his fishing rights. I never wanted to be famous, Tom told one reporter. I just wanted to drink my coffee and catch some bass in my own backyard. But sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but Walsh had even better news for Tom. The HOA's insurance company is desperately trying to settle the civil lawsuit, Walsh explained. They know they're going to lose at trial and they want to avoid a jury verdict that could be even more expensive. How much are they offering? Tom asked. Walsh smiled. $2.5 million, plus all your legal fees, plus a permanent injunction preventing any future HOA interference with your property. Tom was stunned. $2.5 million was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. But more importantly, it was justice for what they'd put him and Linda through. There's one more thing, Walsh said. As part of the settlement, Patricia Henley has to personally deliver a written apology to you and announce her resignation from the HOA board. Tom thought about that Saturday morning when he'd been handcuffed in his own backyard while Patricia Henley smiled coldly and claimed authority over his property. The idea of her having to apologize and admit she was wrong felt almost better than the money, almost. The settlement conference took place in Judge Harrison's courtroom on a crisp October morning. Tom sat next to Walsh at the plaintiff's table, watching as Patricia Henley and her lawyers filed in looking defeated and desperate. The contrast with their arrogant confidence from months earlier couldn't have been more stark. Patricia looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past few months. The stress of the FBI investigation, criminal charges, and impending bankruptcy had taken its toll. Her husband David wasn't even there. He was in federal custody awaiting trial on environmental terrorism charges. Judge Harrison reviewed the settlement terms with both sides. The HOA's insurance company would pay Tom $2.5 million in damages. All of Tom's legal fees would be covered. The HOA would issue a permanent written guarantee never to interfere with Tom's property rights again. And Patricia Henley would personally deliver a public apology. Mrs. Henley, Judge Harrison said sternly, this court has reviewed the evidence in this case, and I find your conduct to be among the most egregious violations of property rights I've seen in 25 years on the bench. You used your position of authority to harass an innocent family and attempt to steal their property through fraudulent legal claims. Patricia stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she unfolded a piece of paper. Mr. Rivera, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I want to formally apologize for my actions against you and your family. I abused my position as HOA president to pursue personal financial gain at your expense. I filed false complaints, made fraudulent legal claims, and engaged in criminal harassment of your family. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Tom felt a mix of satisfaction and pity watching Patricia humiliate herself. Part of him enjoyed seeing the woman who'd caused him so much pain finally getting what she deserved. But another part of him just felt sad that it had come to this. Furthermore, Patricia continued, I am hereby resigning from the HOA board and transferring all my duties to interim leadership. I will never again seek any position of authority in this or any other homeowner association. Judge Harrison accepted the settlement and dismissed the case. As Tom and Walsh left the courtroom, a crowd of reporters was waiting outside. The story of the fishing rancher who'd taken down a criminal conspiracy had captured national attention. Mr. Rivera, what are you going to do with the settlement money? One reporter asked. Tom thought about the question for a moment. $2.5 million was more money than he'd ever imagined having. He could retire tomorrow if he wanted to. He could buy a bigger ranch, travel the world, or just sit by his lake for the rest of his life without a care in the world. First thing I'm going to do is buy my wife the biggest diamond ring I can find, Tom said, getting a laugh from the crowd. She stood by me through all of this when a lot of people would have run away. What about the property that caused all this trouble? Another reporter asked. I'm going to keep fishing in my lake, Tom said firmly. That's all I ever wanted to do in the first place. But I'm also going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Tom meant that promise. Over the next few months, he used part of the settlement money to establish the Property Rights Defense Fund, a legal aid organization that helped homeowners fight back against HOA overreach and property fraud schemes. The fund's first case was helping an elderly couple in the next county who were being harassed by their HOA for keeping chickens in their backyard. The second case involved a young family whose HOA was trying to force them to remove a children's playground from their own yard. We've learned something important from Tom's case, Walsh explained to the media. These property-grabbing schemes are more common than people realize, but they can be stopped if property owners know their rights and have the resources to fight back. The criminal trial of Patricia and David Henley made headlines across the country. The prosecution laid out the full scope of the conspiracy, showing how they'd targeted multiple families and stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property through fraudulent HOA actions. Patricia pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. David got 7 years for his role in the environmental contamination scheme. The owner of Prestige Property Solutions received 12 years for running a criminal enterprise. But the real victory for Tom came on a quiet Saturday morning 6 months after the settlement. He woke up early, grabbed his coffee and fishing rod, and walked down to his dock just as the sun was coming up over the lake. For the first time in over a year, he was able to sit by his lake in complete peace. No police cars racing down his driveway, no HOA officials threatening him with violations, no lawyers or reporters or federal agents, just Tom, his coffee, and the fish waiting in his lake. Linda joined him after about an hour, bringing fresh coffee and homemade biscuits. Any luck? She asked, settling into the chair next to him. Caught 3 bass already, Tom replied. But that's not really the point, is it? Linda smiled. No, I guess it's not. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning mist rise off the water. Tom thought about how much their lives had changed since that terrible Saturday morning, when the police had handcuffed him in his own backyard. The financial settlement had been life-changing, but that wasn't the most important thing they'd gained. They'd learned that ordinary people could fight back against corruption and win. They'd discovered that sometimes standing up to bullies was the only way to stop them from hurting other people. Tom's story had inspired dozens of other property owners to fight back against HOA harassment. The Property Rights Defense Fund was helping families across the country protect their homes from fraudulent legal schemes. You know what the best part is? Linda asked. What's that? We get to grow old here, in our own house by our own lake without anyone trying to steal it from us. Tom nodded. That was exactly what he'd been fighting for all along. Not the money, not the fame, not even the satisfaction of seeing Patricia Henley go to prison. He'd been fighting for the simple right to live peacefully on his own property. A year later, Tom hosted the first annual Freedom to Fish tournament on his lake. Over 100 people showed up, including several families that the Property Rights Defense Fund had helped protect from HOA harassment. They raised $20,000 for legal aid and had the biggest fish fry the county had ever seen. Richard Walsh was there, along with Bill Thompson and several other neighbors who'd supported Tom during the darkest days of the legal battle. Even Judge Harrison stopped by to congratulate Tom on his victory. "You know," Walsh told Tom as they watched kids playing by the lake, "a lot of people said you were crazy to fight this. They said you should have just taken their first settlement offer and moved away." "What do you think?" Tom asked. "I think you did exactly the right thing. You didn't just save your own property. You probably saved dozens of other families from going through the same thing." As the sun set over the lake that evening, Tom reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A year and a half ago, he'd been a simple rancher who just wanted to fish in peace. Now he was a nationally known advocate for property rights, with enough money to retire comfortably and the satisfaction of knowing he'd made a real difference in the world. But the most important thing hadn't changed at all. He was still sitting by his lake, still fishing for bass, still enjoying the peaceful morning ritual that had started this whole adventure. The only difference was that now he knew for certain that no one could ever take it away from him again. Cast his line into the calm water and smiled. Sometimes the biggest victories come from the simplest acts of courage. Sometimes standing up for what's right is as easy as refusing to give up what's yours. And sometimes the best revenge is just living well on your own terms, no matter who tries to stop you. The fish were biting. The coffee was hot, and Tom Rivera was exactly where he belonged. On his own land, by his own lake, living the life he'd worked so hard to build and fought so hard to protect. It didn't get much better than that.